It is June of 1943 at Stalag Luft III, a German prisoner of war camp for Allied airmen hidden deep in the pine forests of Silesia. Inside the wire, the men live in a world of dust, boredom, and the endless shuffle of the circuit path worn around the compound. Flight Lieutenant Peter Howard and Captain John Clinton are walking that circuit, two prisoners searching for a way out. They have tried nothing yet because every escape attempt seems doomed from the start. Then a whirlwind rises out of the forest, tearing across the camp with dust and debris. A sheet of newspaper climbs the spiral, rising 50 feet or more, and drifts beyond the barbed wire into the trees. John Clinton stops. He watches the newspaper float down and disappear. He is 21 years old, dark-haired, with the thin frame of a student, and in that moment an idea takes hold of him. John Clinton turns to Peter Howard, his voice calm but his mind racing. The newspaper did not walk to the trees. It flew. What if a man could be lifted out the same way? Not by wind, of course, but by a box. A vaulting horse. The Trojan horse of the old story. You carry it out into the compound every day, pretending to practice gymnastics. Beneath it, one man digs a tunnel, the horse hides the hole. The vaulters cover the noise. It is a simple trick, but tricks are what prisoners live on. Peter Howard sees the logic at once. They take the idea to the escape committee, who approve it with cautious skepticism. No one has broken out of this camp yet. The odds say no one will. But Peter and John begin planning, because planning is the only weapon a prisoner has left. A week later, a tunnel from the washhouse led by a prisoner named Bill White is discovered by the Germans. The German guards, known as ferrets for their skill at rooting out tunnels, hose down the concrete floor, spot the soap-filled joints of the trap, and seal the tunnel within an hour. The discovery proves how difficult it is to hide a hole from men who spend all day looking for one. But Peter Howard and John Clinton push forward. With the help of Wing Commander Wings Cameron, they steal timber from an unfinished bathhouse and plywood from Red Cross packing cases. They build the vaulting horse in secret. It stands 4.5 feet high, 5 feet long, with a base 3 feet wide. The sides are covered in plywood sheets. The top is padded with bedding and canvas. 4 slots cut in the plywood allow steel bearers to slide through so the horse can be carried like a sedan chair. The horse is stored in the canteen, and every afternoon the prisoners carry it out into the compound, set it down by the football pitch, and begin to vault. The Germans watch. They laugh at the clumsy ones. They do not yet know that beneath the horse a shaft is sinking into the sand. July arrived, and the work on the shaft intensified. The vaulting horse had become a daily fixture in the compound, a cover for the hole beneath it, but the real labor was underground. The vertical shaft was now a narrow pit 5 feet deep, barely wide enough for a man to crouch in, and the first problem hit them immediately: what to do with the sand. They could not pile it up beside the horse. The ferrets would spot that in minutes. Each shovelful had to be carried back inside the horse, hidden in cloth bags, and dispersed around the camp later. The air in the shaft was foul, and the summer heat turned the confined space into an oven. They worked in shifts, one digging, the other standing guard, sweating in silence. The tunnel snaked forward inch by inch. At first it was easy, straight through soft yellow sand. Then came the roots' thin tree fingers that snagged the trowel and brought down trickles of dirt. The deeper they went, the worse the air became. Crawling back to the shaft took longer each time, and the bags of sand seemed heavier. They could barely fill 12 bags in 2 hours. They were exhausted, and the tunnel was only 40 feet long. One afternoon, a small hole opened in the ground near the vaulting horse. Howard, standing nearby, saw it appear and heard no response from Clinton below. He dropped to his knees and called down into the tunnel, his voice urgent. Clinton answered weakly from the darkness. There had been a fall, but he could clear it. They covered the breach with a blanket and a man's body, pretending the vaulter had twisted his ankle, until Clinton could seal the gap from below. The system was failing. 40 feet was their limit. They needed more sand out each day, and they needed a third man to manage the chaos above ground. They built a simple metal basin, 18 inches across, attached to a rope. One man dug at the face, filled the basin, and tugged the line. The man in the shaft pulled it back, emptied the sand into bags, and sent the basin forward again. This doubled their output. Philip Rowe, a meticulous organizer, joined the team. He handled the vaulting schedule, the sand dispersal, and the stooges who watched for ferrets. Rowe insisted on wearing clothes in the tunnel, a foolish risk, but they needed him, so they let him have his way. The trowel they used every day was a bricklayer's tool, stolen months ago from the unfinished bathhouse. Its blade was worn thin, and the wooden handle was cracked from sweat and grit. It was their only weapon against the earth. With the new system, they dug faster, but the tunnel was now over 80 feet long. The air at the face was almost unbreathable. They had to enlarge the tunnel end, creating a bulge to give the digger room to kneel. It was slow, dangerous work. Any sudden movement could bring the roof down. They worked naked to reduce the sand they scraped off the walls, and the sweat caked the dust into a gray paste on their skin. September brought a crisis. Clinton was at the face when a tree root, weakened by the summer heat, gave way. A cascade of sand poured into the tunnel, burying his legs and pinning him on his back. He could not move, could not call out. Howard, waiting in the shaft, felt the rope go slack. He crawled the length of the tunnel, his heart pounding, and found Clinton half buried in the dark. He dug him out with his bare hands, scooping sand until Clinton could free his legs and crawl backward to the shaft. The next day, Howard lay on his back in the tunnel, fitting new wooden shoring into place, working entirely by feel, packing sand above the boards to prevent another fall. Peter Howard collapsed the following week. Physical strain, the sleepless nights, and the constant worry finally caught up with him. He reported to the camp hospital, and the British doctor ordered a week of complete rest. He lay in a clean bed, listening to rain on the roof, and thought about nothing. For 7 days he did not dig, did not vault, did not plan. He listened to Beethoven on a portable gramophone and watched the summer storms roll in from the forest. When he returned to the compound, he was pale but steady. The tunnel had not been discovered, and the work resumed. By October, the tunnel had reached the wire. They had measured the distance carefully, but something had gone wrong. Howard pushed a thin iron poker up through the roof of the tunnel, and when it broke the surface, it was 15 feet to the left of where he expected it to be. The end of the tunnel was under the wire, but angled wrong. They corrected the course and began molding the final stretch, pushing the tunnel upward toward the surface. The last 10 feet would have to be dug without the horse in a single push, risking the dogs and the arc lamps. The escape committee supplied forged identity papers, French workers named Michel Condé and Marcel Levasseur, employed by a factory in Breslau. Peter Howard and John Clinton memorized their new names and studied the train schedules. The break was set for the last week of October. They planned to surface at 6 in the evening, when the guards changed, and rely on a diversion from the huts nearest the wire to cover their escape. The tunnel was ready. The horse had done its job. Now it was a matter of waiting for the right moment. On the morning of October 29th, the plan moved into its final phase. John Clinton, wearing the black-dyed combinations and hood that would serve as camouflage in the darkness, crawled under the vaulting horse and was carried out to the tunnel site by the vaulting team. He took with him the 3 kit bags containing their civilian clothes, forged papers, and food. By 1 in the afternoon, Clinton was sealed into the tunnel, buried alive in the narrow darkness, with only a small air hole to the surface and the knowledge that he must wait alone for hours while the afternoon roll call came and went. After roll call, Peter Howard and Philip Rowe made their way to the canteen and crawled under the horse for the 3rd time that day. Mackay, the smallest of the regular vaulters, came with them to seal the trap after they went down. The horse creaked and sagged under the weight of 3 men as the bearers carried it across the football pitch. In the dim light of the tunnel, Howard found Clinton exhausted but triumphant. He had already dug several feet of new ground. At exactly 6 in the evening, with the diversion roaring from the nearest hutsmen shouting, singing, banging the walls, Clinton broke through the final crust of sand and pulled himself into the open air. He rolled his kit bag into the shallow ditch beside the road and vanished into the pine forest. Howard followed, his heart pounding as he dragged himself across the open ground in the full glare of the arc lamps, expecting a bullet at any second. Rowe came last, and together the 3 men gathered in the darkness of the trees, free of the wire for the first time in months. They walked deep into the forest, stripped off the black combinations and sprinkled them with pepper to confuse the guard dogs. Dressed now in their civilian clothes, berets, macintoshes, and the forged identity papers of French workers, they doubled back toward the railway station in Sagan. Howard's face was newly shaven, his beard gone, and Clinton's long hair had been cut short. They reached the station without incident and joined the queue for tickets to Frankfurt. As Clinton bought 2 tickets at the grill, Howard stood near the timetable scanning the crowd. The Hauptmann doctor from the camp hospital walked past within 2 feet of him. Howard stooped to fumble with his attaché case hiding his face, and the doctor passed without a glance. The train was half an hour late, but it came at last, and they climbed aboard, standing in the dark corridor as the wheels carried them away from Sagan and into the night. They stood all the way to Frankfurt, too crowded and nervous to speak. From there they took a local train to Kustrin, arriving late and exhausted. Every hotel they tried was full. They walked out of the town and found a dry concrete drain under a road hidden from view by scrub and weeds. There they ate their corned beef sandwiches and slept fitfully, huddled together for warmth with their heads on their bags and the cold ground beneath them. Back at Stalag Luft III, the tunnel was discovered at midnight when a sentry relieved from the watchtower nearest the break put his foot into the hole. The alarm went up instantly. Armed guards surrounded the huts and the camp was sealed. Inside his darkened room, Nigel Wilde heard the shouting and saw the torches flashing near the wire. He knew then that his own plan to use the tunnel the following day was dead. The next morning, the Germans ordered a full identity parade on the football pitch. Each prisoner was called by name to a table where photographs and fingerprints were checked against files. The prisoners delayed the process as long as they could. Some had grown beards, others had shaved them off, and many claimed not to hear their names called. Wing Commander Cameron punted a rugby ball straight at the table, overturning the files in a scrum of scrambling Kriegies, and the parade descended into chaos. The Germans eventually restored order with a show of force, combat troops with Tommy guns ringing the parade ground. By 2 in the afternoon, they had identified the 3 missing men, Howard, Clinton, and Rowe. The 3 ghosts who had stood in for them at roll call were marched off to the cooler. Nigel Wilde returned to his room knowing that the tunnel was sealed and the horse had been carried away to the Kommandanter Museum. He lay on his bunk and let himself sleep, the tension of the long vigil finally released. At dawn on October 30th, Howard and Clinton left their ditch outside Kustrin and walked back into the town. They bought coffee at a crowded station waiting room, then caught a local stopping train to Stettin. The carriage was full of civilians, and they stood together in the corridor, saying nothing, afraid to meet each other's eyes. At every stop, they expected a police check, but none came. They arrived in Stettin to a cold wind and driving rain. The station square was bomb-damaged, the streets dark and unfamiliar. They began the round of hotels, but every one was full. As night fell and the rain continued, they walked the streets with no idea where to go. A policeman stopped them on a long concrete road, and Clinton launched into a stream of French, waving his hands and shrugging his shoulders. The policeman hesitated, then let them pass. They ducked down a side street and climbed a garden fence into a cabbage field. Behind the houses, they found a wooden air raid shelter, its roof banked with earth and turf, a bale of dry straw inside. They stripped off their wet macintoshes and shoes, burrowed into the straw, and lay shivering in the darkness. Howard set a tin outside to collect rainwater for morning porridge. Then they slept, exhausted but still free, deep in the heart of the enemy's country. They woke stiff and cold in the wooden shelter as the first gray light of November crept over the cabbage field. Howard and Clinton had no food, no water, and their money was running low. They walked back toward the docks, hoping the crowds of morning workers would hide them. A Frenchman in a leather jacket stopped them in the street, studied their faces, and gave them an address, the Hotel Schobel, a cheap establishment near the waterfront that took foreign workers without too many questions. Clinton did the talking at the registration desk. He made his voice flat and his French casual. The forged identity papers, Michel Condé and Marcel Levasseur, held up under the porter's glance. They took a room on the second floor, washed the grime from their skin, and ate their first proper meal in 2 days. For a few hours they were warm, safe, and almost normal. That afternoon they walked the docks, but their destination was a French workers' camp near the waterfront. There, Clinton spoke to a Corsican barber named Jojo Lacourse. He was short, sharp-featured, and his eyes moved constantly. He understood at once that the 2 men in berets were not what they claimed to be. Jojo promised to find them a ship. He told them to come back to the Café Schiff at 8 o'clock the following evening. While they waited, they met 2 French boys, no older than 18, who carried a dock pass for the Reyherwerder coaling station. The boys were trying to stow away on a coal barge bound for the Rhine. Howard noticed the pass, a thin pink card with a photograph and a police stamp. Howard borrowed the pass from the French boys. He had Indian ink, a tube of carbon paper, and sheets of thin card in his attaché case. He laid the tools on the dressing table in the hotel room and began to copy the card by hand. He traced the Gothic lettering, the eagle, the swastika, and the police signature with slow, deliberate strokes. It was delicate work, and he did not trust himself to rush. By evening, the forgeries were finished. They were not perfect, but they would pass a quick inspection. Clinton woke from a deep sleep and examined the copies without comment. Philip Rowe, who had been lying low in a separate room, came in and told them he was leaving. He would travel alone to Danzig, where he thought his chances of finding a neutral ship were better. They shook hands and he was gone. November 3rd, they walked to the Café d'Accordion for their meeting with Jojo. A florid-faced man with round glasses followed them through the streets. He appeared at every corner, lingered at every door. Clinton spotted him first. The man had been in every café they had visited for 2 days. Howard's stomach tightened. They had been found. The man was Jojo's brother. He had been watching them to make sure they did not talk to the wrong people. Jojo himself appeared soon after, accompanied by 2 men named Pierre and André. André was a French resistance member running sabotage operations from the docks. He interviewed Howard alone in a back room, striking him lightly in the face to test his reaction. Howard lunged at him before he could stop himself. André smiled. "You are no German spy," he said. He told them to be ready. A Danish freighter called the S.I. Norensen would take them to Copenhagen the next morning. The morning of November 4th broke cold and damp over the docks of Stettin. Sigmund Held Jensen arrived at the Café Schiff carrying a set of dock passes and seaman's cards for the 2 Englishmen. He was young, barely 19, with a fair complexion and a formal politeness that masked his nerves. He told Howard and Clinton to follow him separately through the Freihafen gates, then board the S.I. Norensen one at a time. The ship was a small black freighter with the name of the port of Copenhagen painted across her stern. In the forecastle, the boatswain Lorentzen greeted them with a bottle of schnapps in his hand and a scar running white across his jaw. He was a big man, loud and confident, and he told them not to worry. The German search party would come aboard before the ship sailed, and he knew how to handle them. When the soldiers arrived with their dogs and their storm lanterns, Lorentzen slid a panel aside in the forepeak and pushed the 3 stowaways into a dark cubbyhole behind the bows. Howard sat on a coil of rope, trying to slow his breathing, listening to the boots on the deck above. Lorentzen poured schnapps for the guards and kept them talking in the forecastle for half an hour. The search passed without discovery. At Swinemünde, the ship anchored for the final German inspection. The anchor chain crashed down into the locker where the stowaways were hiding, spraying them with rust and mud. When the ship weighed anchor and headed for Copenhagen, they allowed themselves to believe they had made it out of Germany. The Norensen docked in Copenhagen that afternoon. Sigmund led Howard and Clinton through the dark streets to a flat owned by his stepbrother. There they hid for 2 days, listening to the BBC on a radiogram. On the 3rd day, Sigmund returned and told them the ship was ready to sail for Norway. That night a storm struck the Baltic. The old freighter pitched and rolled with violent shuddering jerks, the propeller racing and catching as it left the water. Howard and Clinton were moved deeper into the bilges, where the water sloshed over the floor plates and the air stank of engine oil and salt. Both men became violently seasick. Dawn came slowly through a gray, wind-torn sky. Sigmund Helm Jensen found them shivering and exhausted in the anchor locker, their faces pale and drawn. He helped them up through the hatches onto the deck, where the clean air hit them like a shock. Across the water, low on the horizon, lay the coast of Sweden. A pilot boat came alongside, and the transfer was quick. A rope ladder over the side, a jump into the heaving launch, and strong hands pulling them aboard. From the pilot boat they were taken ashore, where a Swedish police sergeant took charge of them. Within hours they were on a train to Stockholm. The compartment was clean and warm, and the landscape outside the window showed a country at peace, red farmhouses, frozen lakes and forests that had never known a bomb. Howard watched it slide past in silence. At the British legation in Stockholm, they were debriefed by the military attaché, Colonel Millington Butt. The questions were thorough, the welcome polite but cautious. That same afternoon, while walking through the corridors of the legation, Howard rounded a corner and came face to face with Philip Rowe. Rowe had escaped via Danzig, found a Swedish ship, and arrived in Stockholm 3 days ahead of them. He was wearing a suit that actually fit. The legation housed them in a comfortable hotel and gave them money for clothes and meals. They ate proper food again, slept in soft beds, and felt the constant knot of tension in their shoulders begin to loosen. But the flight home did not come quickly. They were told to wait. The days stretched into weeks, and they grew restless, trapped again in a kind of comfortable limbo. One evening in late November, Howard and Clinton went drinking in the old city of Stockholm. They were tired of waiting, tired of being polite guests in a neutral country. The night got away from them. They found themselves outside the German embassy, where a large Nazi flag hung floodlit over the front entrance. The building was quiet. The street was empty. Howard climbed onto Clinton's shoulders and pulled the flag down. They carried it through the dark streets to the square in front of the royal palace, where a Christmas tree stood decorated for the holiday season. They piled the flag under the tree and set it on fire. The flames climbed the red bunting and caught the dry branches of the tree itself, sending sparks into the night sky above the palace. The fire was soon extinguished by a police patrol, but the damage was done. The German embassy lodged a formal protest with the Swedish government. The British legation received an angry telephone call from the Foreign Office. Millington Butt was livid. He ordered Howard and Clinton to surrender the flag immediately. Howard told him they had burned it. The colonel stared at them for a long moment and then made a phone call to delay their return flight by another week. In Norway, the Gestapo had not forgotten the Norrenson. After the ship sailed for Oslo, a crewman with a broken leg who had been given a bunk in the forecastle turned out to be a Gestapo informer. He pointed at Larenson and Sigmund Hjelm Jensen as the men who had helped the English stowaways. Both were arrested and taken to the Victoria Terrasse headquarters in Oslo for questioning. Larenson was transferred to the Grini concentration camp. Sigmund was moved to Copenhagen's West Prison, where he was interrogated weekly. His stepmother, a Danish woman who had worked as a children's nurse in Germany before the First World War, went to the Gestapo to plead for his release. She brought with her a poetry book she had kept from those years, filled with entries from German friends. One of the signatures was that of the Gestapo officer now questioning her son. He studied the handwriting, looked at the woman, and said, "We have both changed a little." He signed the release papers. On December 28th, Howard and Clinton were finally put on a Mosquito aircraft at Bromma Airfield and flown across the North Sea to Scotland. The landing at Leuchars was cold and damp. A major in the intelligence corps took their names and numbers without asking them to sit down, issued travel warrants, and sent them to the airmen's mess for leftover bacon and potatoes. Howard looked at Clinton and said nothing. They had escaped Germany, crossed the Baltic in a storm hidden from the Gestapo, and were now being processed like lost luggage. They took the train to Edinburgh and then the Flying Scotsman to London. At the Air Ministry, Howard reported to a clerk who did not have him on any list. At the War Office, Clinton was told to wait for a vacancy on a course. The war in Europe was still raging, and there was no ceremony for returned prisoners. They simply walked out of the building into the London fog and stood on the pavement, free for the first time in nearly a year. Howard returned to flying, completed a pilot's course, and wrote this story under his own name. Clinton went back to his regiment and served out the war. Roe made his way home from Sweden and resumed his life. Sigmund Hjelm Jensen became a ship's captain, married a girl named Kama, and retired to an island off Spain. Many of those who helped them survived the war, though others were less fortunate. They were not heroes looking for medals. They were ordinary men who refused to accept that a fence and a locked door meant the end of the fight. If you have a story of your own from those years, something a parent or grandparent passed down, drop it in the comments. We read everyone, subscribe, and hit like. If you want more stories like this, thank you for listening.